June 24, 1945, 10:32 a.m. Red Square, Moscow. Rain drizzled across the cobblestones as Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov rode his white stallion through Red Square, the echo of hooves thundering like distant artillery. Rows of Soviet soldiers snapped to attention, medals glinting despite the gray sky. Captured Nazi banners were flung onto the soaked pavement, trampled beneath marching boots. And at the center of it all, unmoving, expression unreadable, eyes sharp as a saber, rode the man the soldiers called the Iron Marshal. Zhukov had led the Red Army from the catastrophic ashes of 1941 to the triumphant storming of Berlin. He had broken the Wehrmacht at Moscow. He had crushed them at Stalingrad. He had thrown open the gates of the Reich's capital with fire and steel. To the soldiers lining the square, he looked like a war god carved from granite. But behind the applause, behind the ceremony, something darker stirred. Joseph Stalin watched from the reviewing stand, his gloved hands clasped together, face expressionless beneath the brim of his cap. No one could see his eyes behind the drifting rain. No one except Zhukov. And as the white horse carried him past the Soviet leader, the marshal felt the chill of a different kind of battle, one with no front lines, no artillery, no uniforms. A political battle. A dangerous one. The crowd roared. Soldiers cheered. Generals saluted. But Stalin did not clap. As soon as the ceremony ended, Zhukov dismounted and saluted sharply. The two men locked eyes. For a heartbeat the world seemed to freeze, not in triumph, but in tension. Zhukov could read Stalin's expression the way he read battlefield maps. Cold calculation, cautious admiration, and fear. Zhukov had become too popular, too successful, too adored by the Red Army. And Stalin never shared glory. That night, Zhukov returned to his office, medals still pinned to his tunic. The corridors of the Kremlin were unusually quiet, the lamps casting long shadows onto the marble floor. The victory celebrations echoed distantly in the city outside, but inside these walls, silence ruled. A courier knocked and handed him a sealed envelope. Zhukov tore it open. Marshal Zhukov is hereby reassigned from command of the Soviet occupation forces in Germany. Effective immediately. He stared at the paper. His jaw tightened. After leading the greatest victory in Soviet history, he was being moved aside. Not promoted. Not honored. Reassigned. It was the first strike. The first punishment for being too victorious. The marshal folded the paper, placed it on his desk, and extinguished the lamp. The faint echoes of Moscow's celebrations faded behind him as he walked into the darkness of the corridor. He had defeated Hitler. He had defeated the Wehrmacht. But now he would face an enemy far more dangerous. His own leader. And Stalin had only just begun. Zhukov's removal from Germany rippled through the Soviet officer corps like a cold wind. The Red Army trusted him, revered him, even feared him, but Stalin feared him more. And fear, in the Kremlin, always grew into suspicion. By the autumn of 1946, rumors slithered through Moscow's military corridors. Whispers that Zhukov had Western tendencies. Accusations that he'd grown too close to American officers during the occupation. Claims that he hoarded trophies from Berlin. They were lies, half-truths, distortions, but Stalin didn't need proof. He needed justification. One evening, as Zhukov returned to his modest Moscow apartment after a grueling day of political interrogations, he found two NKVD officers waiting in the stairwell. Their faces were blank. Their boots glistened with melting snow. "Comrade Marshal," one said, "your presence is required for questioning." Zhukov felt his stomach tighten. Not with fear. He'd faced death too many times for that. But with anger. Anger that after sacrificing everything for his country, he was now being treated like a criminal. Still, he followed them. He had no choice. Hours passed under the glare of a single, buzzing lamp. They questioned him about his time in Germany, about the gold and valuables he'd allegedly stolen, about his supposed political ambitions. Zhukov denied none of the facts, only the intent. And every answer he gave seemed to anger the officers more. Finally, one interrogator leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Do you believe the Red Army follows you more than Comrade Stalin?" Zhukov didn't move, didn't blink. "If the soldiers respect me," he said quietly, "it is because they know I respect them." The interrogator's fist slammed onto the table. That is not an answer. But it was an answer. and it became the line Marxist bureaucrats would repeat behind closed doors for months. Zhukov is loved. Zhukov is trusted. Zhukov is dangerous. Soon after, Stalin struck again. A new order exiled Zhukov to Odessa military district, far from Moscow, far from influence, far from the heart of the Red Army he had once commanded. He arrived there in bitter winter winds, greeting soldiers who stared at him with disbelief. The hero of Berlin, one whispered, sent here. Another muttered, Stalin is afraid of heroes. Zhukov spent nights walking along the frozen harbor, hands behind his back, the weight of humiliation pressing into his spine. He was no longer the marshal who paraded on horseback through Red Square. He was isolated, monitored, stripped of power, but that isolation only strengthened him. He trained officers ruthlessly, reinforced discipline, demanded excellence. Soldiers under him became sharper, faster, smarter, and word of his success reached Moscow despite attempts to silence it. Stalin gritted his teeth. He couldn't imprison Zhukov. The man was too famous, too symbolic. But he could bury him deeper. In 1948, a second exile came. The Ural military district. Colder, farther, lonelier. Zhukov boarded the night train, frost glittering on the windows as the locomotive shrieked into darkness. Behind him, Moscow glowed faintly, out of reach, out of memory, out of power. His career seemed over. A fallen hero cast into the wilderness. But the world was changing. Stalin was aging. And Zhukov's enemies were many. But his admirers were countless. He didn't know it yet. But a day was coming when he would return to Moscow, not in disgrace, but in triumph. And this time, he would help remove the very man Stalin had placed to control him. The winter winds of the Urals howled like wounded artillery, but Zhukov endured them with the same stoic resolve that carried him through Stalingrad's frozen trenches. Exile hardened him, sharpened him. He inspected barracks with cold precision, rode horseback across snowbound fields, and drilled officers who couldn't believe the man shaping them was the very marshal who once commanded the armies that crushed the Wehrmacht. Yet even as he rebuilt forgotten divisions, the Kremlin watched him like a hawk. Letters from Moscow arrived late, or not at all. His calls for better equipment went unanswered. His political enemies whispered poison into Stalin's ear. And still Zhukov refused to bend. He would not beg. He would not flatter. He would not crawl back to power on his knees. But power, unexpectedly, began shifting toward him. In March 1953, the unthinkable happened. Stalin died. The news rippled through the Soviet Union like an earthquake. Streets filled with weeping citizens. Government offices froze. Ministers whispered behind locked doors, not out of grief, but fear. Stalin hadn't named a clear successor. His inner circle, Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, each maneuvered behind the scenes, ready to tear each other apart to inherit the throne. In the chaos, one name resurfaced. A name too powerful to ignore. Marshal Zhukov. Not as a ruler. He didn't want that. But as the one man the army trusted unconditionally. Within days, a black ZS limousine arrived at Zhukov's headquarters. Out stepped Nikita Khrushchev, hat in hand, frost clinging to his coat. He greeted Zhukov with the uneasy respect of a politician approaching a lion. Comrade Marshal, Khrushchev began, the country needs you. Moscow needs you. Zhukov studied him. For what purpose? Khrushchev glanced at the guards and lowered his voice. To remove Beria. Lavrentiy Beria, the ruthless NKVD chief, Stalin's feared enforcer, was making a move for power. If he succeeded, the purges would begin anew. The terror would deepen, and the Soviet Union would drown in blood. Only one man in the entire USSR could counterbalance Beria's influence. Only one name commanded the absolute loyalty of the Red Army. Zhukov. Days later, Zhukov sat in the back of a staff car racing through Moscow's morning traffic. He'd barely slept. Ahead loomed the imposing gray facade of the Kremlin. Inside, a secret meeting was underway. Khrushchev and the Presidium confronted Beria with accusations of treason. Beria laughed, at first, until Zhukov walked in. The marshal stepped into the chamber in full uniform, chest heavy with medals, his presence snapping the room into silence. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply gave the order. Lavrentiy Pavlovich Beria, you are under arrest. For the first time anyone could remember, Beria's confidence cracked. He stammered, protested, tried to invoke Stalin's name. But the guard stepped forward. And Zhukov, the man Stalin had feared, watched coldly as Beria was taken away. The Iron Marshal had returned. Not through ambition, not through politics, but through necessity. To the Soviet people, his name suddenly meant stability, honor, a leader untouched by corruption. The man who had saved Moscow once was saving it again. Zhukov was restored to power, reinstated as Deputy Minister of Defense, given back the dignity Stalin had stripped from him. Crowds cheered when he appeared in public. Soldiers saluted with genuine pride. Veterans wept when he shook their hands. But fate wasn't done with him yet. Because within a few years, Zhukov's newfound influence, his independence, and the loyalty of millions would again frighten the Kremlin. And this time, the price would not be exile. It would be political erasure. The years after Beria's downfall were the brightest Zhukov had known since Berlin. He inspected divisions with renewed authority. He modernized the Soviet army, pushing for reforms that terrified the old Stalinist guard. Better pay, better training, fewer pointless purges. Soldiers stood taller when he entered a room. Veterans revered him. And Khrushchev, at first, embraced him as both protector and partner. But power in the USSR was a fragile thing, especially power earned honestly. By 1957, Zhukov's popularity soared far beyond what the party considered safe. He spoke directly with officers, bypassing political intermediaries. He commanded the Red Army with the loyalty of millions. And while he never sought political office, the simple truth frightened Moscow. The Soviet Union trusted Zhukov more than it trusted its leaders. That kind of trust could topple governments. Whispers began again. Zhukov is too independent. Zhukov challenges party control. Zhukov is becoming dangerous. Khrushchev heard every whisper, and though he owed Zhukov everything, fear slowly replaced gratitude. The same fear Stalin felt. The same fear every insecure ruler feels toward a man who cannot be controlled. The breaking point came during a Presidium meeting in October 1957. Zhukov had just returned from Yugoslavia, where he met Tito and discussed improving relations. The visit was a success, too successful. He returned to Moscow to find the entire Presidium gathered, faces tight and cold. Khrushchev cleared his throat. "Marshal Zhukov," he began, "the party has grave concerns about your personal authority." Silence. Cold. Heavy. "You claim too much independence from the collective leadership," Khrushchev continued. "The military must not become a state within a state. And under your command, it risks becoming exactly that." Zhukov understood immediately. He was being purged again. He stood tall, chest heaving with controlled fury. "I served the Soviet Union on the battlefield. I led our troops to victory. And I have never acted against the people." Khrushchev didn't flinch. "This is not a question of loyalty. It is a question of party control." He paused. "And the party has decided." It was over. Zhukov was stripped of his titles, removed from the defense ministry, dismissed from the Presidium, ordered into abrupt retirement. No hearing, no trial, no chance to speak. Just silence, cold as the Kremlin stones. He returned to his small dacha outside Moscow. No guards, no staff, no power, just a few belongings, some military books, and his memories of a life forged in fire. His telephone rang less and less. Former comrades avoided visiting, fearful of being associated with a fallen hero. The man who had saved the Soviet Union, who had stormed Berlin, who had been cheered by millions, now spent his days walking alone in the quiet forests, fishing in frozen lakes, helping neighbors with chores. And yet, he did not grow bitter. He wrote memoirs. He raised horses. He enjoyed long walks with his wife. He laughed with grandchildren who never understood why strangers whispered his name with awe. Time softened his sorrow. He lived long enough to see the regime that pushed him aside begin to crumble. Long enough to see younger generals cite him as a model. Long enough to see Soviet citizens place flowers beneath his statue. Marshal Georgy Zhukov died on June 18, 1974, peacefully, in his home. Not in disgrace, not in fear, but as a quiet giant. A legend whose shadow stretched across continents. Across Russia, men who had once fought under him stood in silence. Because history had finally done what politics never dared. It gave Zhukov the respect he earned.